One day, in the life of Joan of Arc, the biting cold seeped through the thick wool of the tent, settling as frost on its inner surface. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orléans, saviour of France, awoke long before dawn. Her breath plumed white in the dim light of an oil lamp, which barely illuminated the humble interior. Her hands, accustomed to gripping the hilt of a war sword and leading soldiers into battle, now helplessly rubbed her freezing fingers. Her body, hardened by battles and campaigns, trembled from the cold, and all wounds ached, foreshadowing a long and difficult day. Through the rough fabric of her blanket, she could feel the icy ground. Somewhere in the distance, muffled by the distance and the morning gloom, the sleepy sounds of the siege camp could be heard. A rare cough, the creak of a cart, and the whinny of a horse. Her name echoed across all of France, striking terror into the English and inspiring hope in the French. This peasant girl, who heard the voices of saints, had led the Dauphin Charles to his coronation in Reims, effectively turning the tide of the 100 Years' War. She was feared as a witch and revered as a saint. But now, in late November 1429, her divine purpose felt distant and elusive. She found herself beneath the walls of La Charité-sur-Loire, a city that stubbornly refused to yield. This siege, protracted and exhausting, was a far cry from the triumphant victories at Orléans. There was no miraculous wind here, no swift attacks, and no jubilant crowds. Instead, there was only cold, hunger, and a growing despair. She was plagued by a premonition that this day, starting with an icy shiver and a gnawing ache, could become something more than just another failure. It could mark the beginning of the end for her mission, a harbinger of oblivion and betrayal. The Maid of Orléans, once considered invincible, now faced the mundane, grueling reality of war, where divine intervention felt absent. Her hands, which had so recently made history, now merely tried to warm themselves in the biting cold. We will spend this day with Joan of Arc. We'll explore what the legendary heroine's life was truly like, beyond the official glory and myths, and through her experience, we'll see all the cruelty and harshness of her era. Joan of Arc, born to simple peasants in the village of Domremy, was not destined for greatness. Her childhood was one of labor, spent among the fields and livestock, always in the shadow of the war that was tearing France apart. But at 13, everything changed. She began to hear the voices of saints, Archangel Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. They called upon her to save France from the English and the Burgundians, and to restore the rightful Dauphin Charles to his throne. At 17, Joan, dressed in men's clothing, went to the Dauphin. She convinced him of her divine mission, and then led the French army to a series of incredible victories. These included lifting the siege of Orléans, decisively defeating the English at Piety, and orchestrating the solemn coronation of Charles VII in Reims. These triumphs brought her immense fame, widespread veneration, and the reputation of an invincible maid, truly sent by God. Her name became a symbol of France's revival, and her very presence on the battlefield instilled unwavering faith in the soldiers. However, after Charles VII's coronation, the situation changed. The king and his court, especially the influential favorite Georges de la Trémoille, grew increasingly indifferent towards Joanne and her mission. They were more interested in diplomatic intrigues and truces than the decisive military actions that Joan's voices demanded. The failed assault on Paris, where Joan was wounded and unable to take the city, was the first blow to her reputation. By late 1429, she found herself embroiled in the siege of La Charité-sur-Loire, a strategically important but extremely draining operation. The city, controlled by the rebellious captain Perinet Gressart, a former Burgundian servant, had no direct connection to the English occupation, and its siege was perceived by the court as a secondary task, not deserving of significant resources. Joan risked not only military failure, but also the loss of her divine authority. For her, this was akin to losing her soul, as her entire life had been dedicated to fulfilling God's will. If the siege of La Charité ended in failure, it could undermine the soldiers' faith and give new ammunition to her enemies at court, who had long sought to strip her of her influence. What was at stake was not just victory or defeat in a single battle, but her reputation, her calling, her very future. The map of France, divided into English, Burgundian, and French territories, symbolized this struggle. King Charles VII's lavish court in Chinon, where decisions were made, sharply contrasted with the mud and cold of the siege camp, where Joan battled fatigue and anxiety. Failure at La Charité-sur-Loire could irreversibly alter her destiny, transforming her from a savior into an outcast. This day would become a turning point, solidifying her reputation or utterly destroying it. Joan rose from her hard cot, feeling the biting cold creep beneath the thin fabric of her shift. Her body ached from the constant dampness and old wounds, a stone blow at Jargeau, an arrow that pierced her leg near Paris. Every movement brought a dull pain, reminding her of the brutality of past battles. She was used to it, but today the weariness felt particularly deep, ingrained in every bone. First, she performed her morning rituals. A short but heartfelt prayer to her patron saints was her only solace in this harsh world. Next, she washed her face and hands with icy water from a small pitcher. Cold vapor plumed from her breath as she bent over. It wasn't just a cleansing. It was a ritual of sorts, helping her shake off sleep and gather her thoughts. After that, she dressed in her usual men's clothing. A rough woolen tunic and trousers that offered better protection from the cold and mud than any women's dress, the touch of cold metal against her skin as she donned pieces of her armor, the breastplate, shoulder guards, and gauntlets created a clang that echoed in the quiet tent. It was the sound of her daily life, steel that had become a second skin. Her gaze fell upon the tattered standard depicting Jesus and Mary standing in the corner of the tent. It was a symbol of her mission, her faith, and her victories. But now, before La Charité, its glory seemed distant. Her thoughts focused on the day ahead, the dwindling supplies, and King Charles VII's growing indifference. She understood that her inner world was a battlefield between an unwavering faith in her divine calling and a crushing reality that pressed down harder and harder, threatening to break her spirit. Before Joan had even finished her morning preparations, a breathless courier burst into her tent. His cloak was caked with mud, and his hands, red from the cold, trembled as he extended a sealed letter. This was no joyful news of long-awaited reinforcements or a supply convoy. Instead, it was another dispatch from the royal court, confirming her worst fears. Another request for provisions, and men had been denied. The grim faces of the commanders gathered in the tent underscored the gravity of the situation. A cold wind seeping through the gaps in the canvas seemed to intensify the oppressive atmosphere. The day's main objective was now crystal clear and nearly impossible: to hold the siege of La Charité-sur-Loire, despite dwindling resources and plummeting morale. Every day without external aid hastened the inevitable collapse. Success in this operation would bring only temporary relief, confirming her authority, but doing nothing to change the court's general indifference. Failure, however, would mean the ultimate collapse of her mission, a blow to her divine image, and, quite possibly, the beginning of the end of her influence. Outwardly, Jeanne remained calm. Her face, hidden in the shadow of her helmet, betrayed no emotion, but inside, irritation and weariness were building. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing down, and the king's inaction, along with his advisors, only made things worse. This news not only confirmed her worst fears, but also pushed her mission to the edge of an abyss, forcing her to consider that her divine calling might be powerless against human weakness and betrayal. Jeanne set out to inspect the siege positions. She made her way through the camp, a place consumed by gloom. Thick, clinging mud squelched under her boots with every step. The air hung heavy with the smell of dampness, smoke from sparse campfires and unwashed bodies. Exhausted by the cold and hunger, the soldiers either avoided her gaze or looked at her with desperate, almost pleading hope. Their thin, tattered clothes offered little protection from the biting wind. Pale, gaunt faces, the constant coughs and groans of the sick, all painted a picture of utter hopelessness. The distant clang of siege engines seemed merely a backdrop to this slow, drawn-out dying. She saw a child shivering from the cold by a dying fire, its mother wrapped in rags, staring blankly into the void. Her almost divine image, forged by victories, felt alien here, almost out of place against this horrifying destitution. Internally, Joan's thoughts were stark. This was not the triumph she had dreamed of. This was not the war she was fighting. These were not the people she had inspired. She was accustomed to the rigors of camp life, but this level of despair, this utter hopelessness, weighed on her with a new intensity. Midway through her journey, near one of the tents, Joan witnessed a brutal punishment. A soldier, caught stealing meager provisions, was tied to a post and mercilessly whipped. Each lash echoed with a dull thud, and the man's cries reverberated through the camp. Officers, their faces grim, watched the punishment, signaling that discipline was all that remained. This scene struck Joan deeply, forcing her to confront the true cost of this war, how low morale had fallen, and the desperate plight of her people. It was a stark collision with a world where faith gave way to hunger and hope surrendered to fear. Joan arrived at the front lines, at the siege works of La Charité. The city's formidable walls, covered in frost, loomed over the weary camp. The gleam of her armor beneath the gray sky was the only bright spot in this bleak scene. She gave instructions to the commanders. Her voice, echoing over the siege engines, sounded confident and full of faith. She stood tall, her gestures assured, each word a bid to rekindle their dwindling hope. She moved among the soldiers, radiating an unwavering resolve that had once brought her victory at Orléans. But inside, Joan felt a growing despair. The cold seeped into her very bones, and the doubts she had so carefully hidden began to surface. She recognized the stark contrast between how the chronicles might describe this moment as the heroic stand of the Maid of Orléans, and what she truly felt now. What she felt was a profound, debilitating fatigue, a fear of defeat, and a growing sense of loneliness. Her eyes, hidden in the shadow of her helmet, betrayed a weariness she revealed to no one. She felt her divine image, forged by faith and miracles, crumbling under the pressure of the cold, hunger, and the king's indifference. More than just the burden of responsibility, it was the profound sense of being utterly alone in her mission, devoid of divine support, and lacking any understanding from the very people she served. A drastic change in the situation hit Joan like a cold shower. Sentries, their faces frozen with cold and fear, brought a report. A large supply convoy, on which their last hopes rested, had been intercepted by the Burgundians. The sudden silence that followed the report was deafening. The cold, already piercing, seemed to seep into every cell of Joan's body despite her armor. A shiver ran through her to the bone, and her breath caught. The image of empty carts and looted sacks flashed before her eyes. The feeling that her usual control was slipping away, that her plan was collapsing, was unbearable. All her efforts, all her faith, seemed to shatter against the harsh reality. The choice was clear, yet terrible. Either retreat, admitting defeat and risking her reputation, or condemn the remaining people to starvation and certain failure. Jeanne withdraws, seeking solitude in a dilapidated chapel where a single candle flickers. The cold stone walls seem to absorb her despair. In the silence, broken only by her ragged breathing, she begins an internal monologue. She is tormented by the thought of shame, of losing her faith, and that God might have abandoned her. She asks herself what she is living for, what she continues to fight for, when everyone has turned their back on her. Her own self is measured against something far greater: God, France, and the people who place their hopes in her. She realizes the court has abandoned her, but her calling, her divine mission, still remains. She cannot abandon it. She cannot betray those who still believe. Joan makes a difficult decision: to retreat, to save the lives of the remaining people, and to spare them from starvation. This will cost her her reputation, perhaps even her life, but she is willing to pay that price. Her hands tightly grip a wooden cross, her only support in this moment of profound inner conflict. She retreats, but she does not surrender, bearing the full weight of this decision and its consequences. By evening, Jeanne had returned to her tent. The order to retreat had been given. The dim light inside the tent highlighted the fatigue on her face, but she tried to maintain her composure. The soldiers, though exhausted, felt a sense of relief. Yet their gazes toward Jeanne were mixed with bewilderment and disappointment. Quiet voices from outside the tent, the sounds of the camp being packed up, signaled that the retreat had begun. Some commanders avoided her gaze, while others were overly solicitous, trying to hide their relief. Jeanne felt a growing sense of loneliness and physical exhaustion. The cold, seeping into her very bones, only intensified this feeling. This was more than just a military failure. It was a crack in her divine image, the beginning of the end of her invincibility. The heavy silence between Jeanne and her closest companions spoke volumes. Everyone understood that this failure was merely a harbinger of future trials and Jeanne's ultimate solitude. The changes were only just beginning. The consequences of this day, this bitter retreat from La Charité-sur-Loire, went far beyond its immediate impact. Joan couldn't sleep. The cold and pain kept her awake, piercing her to the bone. She re-evaluated the day not as a simple military failure, but as a harbinger of her future destiny. This day, when the court turned its back on her and her army retreated, was the beginning of the path to her capture, trial, and martyrdom. The vast, star-filled sky above the retreating camp seemed cold and indifferent. The distant, mournful howl of wolves only intensified her sense of solitude. The piercing cold reminded her how fragile life was and how quickly hope could fade. She thought of her tattered standard, now furled, of its former glory and its current obscurity. Yet despite everything, Jeanne looked to the future with unwavering faith. This day had been a harsh trial, but it was not the end. Her hand tightly gripped a wooden cross, her sole anchor. This gesture, the object she held, and her deep faith linked this cold day of retreat to her fiery end. They also connected it to her eternal devotion to God and France, a devotion that would resonate through history for centuries.